Rev up your engines!
Well, Cummins is unveiling a combustion engine that can run on any fuel. Back in the day in NATO, they were saying you had to make tanks and vehicles that could run on any fuel, and they had a lot of mess with them too. It wasn't the greatest idea in the world. Since that was decades ago, the technology has followed up that you could probably get an engine that could run on any kind of fuel these days. With all the computer controls that people have, they could use e-fuels, hydrogen, use all kinds of fuels. And Cummins recently announced that they're going to push towards hydrogen, switch a lot of stuff to hydrogen, so definitely things going to run on hydrogen, right? Hydrogen burns a little differently, so Cummins has designed an optimized combustion chamber for using hydrogen and can build engines for it. Now, of course, it won't be able to run any fuel at any time mixed together with one or the other. They'd have to be set up differently. But today, you can have the computers, hardware, and the software to have an engine that could run on any of them just by changing the parameters of what's going into it. Kind of like a flex fuel car that can run on ethanol, E85, that's 85% ethanol, 15% gasoline, all the way to 100% gasoline. The computers on board let you run any of them on it. And so far for Cummins, this is going to be for diesel, natural gas, and hydrogen, things that they know will work. Of course, the natural gas is already there. There's already an infrastructure. The hydrogen infrastructure would have to be built up. But if you're going to plan on doing something, you got to make the engines way before you put the infrastructure in. So, interesting idea. Forrest Baker says, if my 1970 engine throws a rod, should I expect to replace more than just the engine? Well, not necessarily. The rod, the piston rod, is inside the engine. And if it throws a rod, knocks a hole, well, you're going to have to replace the whole engine. Nobody ever really fixes them like that. Too many broken parts, but replace it with another engine. Now, I mean, I don't know how you've been driving it. Maybe it threw a rod because you drive like a maniac, in which case the transmission might be on its last legs. You put a brand new powerful engine in, it might burn out your old transmission. You might want to change the engine and transmission at the same time. Always think about that if you're going to, upgrade a vehicle. Some hyena says, good day, mate. Is it worth putting an oil catch can on a 2014 VW TDI, 30,000 miles? Thanks for the advice. Yes, it is. Volkswagens have problems with carboning up on stuff. I would definitely put an oil catch can on it. Why not? They don't cost much. They're very simple. A friend of mine down the street, he's got one. He bought it with an oil catch can already put on the thing, and it's not having any problems. We looked in it with a borescope when we saw there wasn't carbon buildup on it, so that's a good idea. Fled21 says, Scotty, what should I choose? A 1.8 i-VTEC 2015 Civic or 2015 2-liter Skyactiv G Mazda 3? Thanks. All right, I'd go hands down for the Civic. Honda makes excellent engines, especially 2015. That's not a turbocharged engine. It's normally aspirated. Those things can run forever. Mazda is making cars a lot better than they used to. Toyota, I believe, owns like 20% of it, and they've got a factory in Alabama where they're making Mazdas and Toyotas on the same assembly line, so they're sharing technology. But that's now. 2015, Mazdas weren't nearly as good as the 2015 Civic. Get the Civic. Vin Bambalis says, 2005 Pontiac Vibe, what's your thoughts? Well, realize, it's a Toyota Matrix. Basically a Corolla with a different body style, with a little hatchback, crossover type style thing on it. They sold in the United States under Pontiac. It's not exactly the same. Engine and tranny and brakes and stuff are. If you're looking at a Toyota Matrix, you're probably going to pay 3 to 4 times that price for a used Matrix than you are for a Vibe, and they're almost the same car. So, now, realize, it's 05, 17-year-old car. So, you want it checked out by a mechanic like me before you buy it, because, who knows, a car that old, anything could be wrong. But they can last quite some time. And being a Pontiac, Pontiacs have bad reputations. You can get them cheaper than the actual Toyota Matrix. Dan Mickens says, I got a 2010 Toyota Avalon XLS, 57,000 miles. When I put it in drive, it takes 3 seconds to drive to kick in. The Toyota dealership says I need a new transmission. Well, before you spend all that money, realize what's happening is you put it in and it doesn't go for 3 seconds because the pump inside is building up pressure. A clogged system will do that. Drop the pan, change the filter and fluid, drive it a couple hundred miles. It might clear up, and if it does, you can thank Scotty, because you know what often does that? A dirty, clogged up transmission filter that it's got to pump the fluid through the filter, which takes a little while when it's cold. Because I've fixed many cars that way, and truthfully, I've even had customers, they don't do anything. So that's an old car, I'll keep driving it. And they drove it that way for another 5 years. And yeah, they had to wait when it was cold, and they put it in a drive for it to move. They found that if they first put it in reverse, backed up a tiny bit, and then put it in drive, then it worked fine. So if that works, sometimes you can do that for years, not even touch the stupid thing. Tony Caprese says, how often should I use that ATS oil and fuel cleaner? Okay, it's a very good cleaner. Let's say you do it once. Let's say you buy a used car, you don't know the history of it, right? So you do it once, run it through, and then it's running fine. And maybe you'll get a borescope and take a spark plug and look inside and see, hey, it's not carboning up yet. If that's the case, maybe you could run that stuff in every 2 or 3 years or something like that. You don't have to do it all that often. It's a good cleaner. But as long as you buy good gasoline, change your oil regularly, you really don't have to do any extra cleaning. You don't want to waste your money on something that you don't need, so you don't have to do it all that often. All right, X says, Scotty, I'm looking to sell my 07 S60 with 136,000 miles in Southern California. Any tips? Depends on what kind of shape it's in. If it's in excellent shape, advertise it. People are paying astronomical prices, especially in California, for used cars these days. Let's say you're getting rid of it because you think it's starting to fall apart. Well, you don't want to get somebody mad at you. In that case, go to CarMax, go to Carvana, go to all those big used car places because they also buy them. And you'd be surprised. Selling cars at such a high price, they'll buy anything and often at a high price too. So if you don't want to deal with the hassle of dealing with people buying your car and getting mad, you might try and see what they offer you. They offer you something good, get rid of it that way. Cruz Orlean says, help Scotty, why are BMW such big money wasters? All the plastic keeps breaking. Well, you kind of explained your own question there. Well, here's the thing, too, They're status cars, BMW. They have been for quite some time. Originally, they were little runabouts, 4 cylinders, 2002 TII fuel injected, one of the first fuel injector cars. And, I've BMW. And they just find that they can make them as cheap as they want, have the plastic break. They're status cars. You can't keep a status car more than 3 or 4 years, then you got to buy another status car, right? So they don't give a crap if everything's made out of plastic because it won't break till the car's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And they don't own it then, so they don't care. And that's probably one of the reasons. They get a lot of money building them and selling them, right? The people who are the original owners, they generally don't keep them all that long, so they don't even care. But they really did go overboard with plastic in BMWs. I had a mechanic friend in Houston. He bought one from one of his customers. He said, Scott, look at this beautiful BMW I got from my customer. He's sick of it. I said, okay, I'm smiling. About a year later, I meet him at the same store. I said, how's that BMW going for you? He said, Scotty, that plastic piece of crap, I sold it last month. It cost me a fortune in repairs and I'm a mechanic. Capo Dal says, Scotty, I love your videos. What do you recommend to do to a 78 Camaro? It's been sitting a couple of years. I bought it from an older guy. It's in great shape, but it's had for a while. Well, 1, change all the fluids and take it for a little drive. Sometimes guys pull fast ones on you. I've had it happen to my grandson, buys and sells cars. Some guys pull fast ones. A lot of times, they're sitting because there's a problem. Now, you might find you change the oil filter, fluids, everything. You get driving. Then when you give it gas, you hear, that means the rods are knocking, and he knew that the rods are knocking, and that's why he parked it in the first place. So do the fluids first, then take it for a trip. And if it's not knocking and it seems good, then check the brakes, all the rubber hoses, everything like that. Take your time, go through it. But you want to check it out first, because let's say the rods are knocking, and you don't want to put another engine in it, then my advice is sell it on. And be honest. Hopefully you didn't pay much for it. And be honest and say, look, I bought this, but the rods are knocking. You got to rebuild the engine. I don't want to do that. You can go that route. But if they're not knocking, follow that other advice. Spade79 says, Scotty, please help. I got a 2002 Mustang, 145,000 miles. When it gets below freezing, I have very little power. It misfires and runs like garbage. As long as it's below freezing, it runs like crap. When it gets above freezing, it runs fine. I took it to mechanics, and they said when it misfires, cylinder 4, 5, and 6 misfire, but not 1, 2, or 3. You got some kind of electronic failure. Often either in the wiring system or the main computer. If it's shutting off those cylinders, not the others. Something is wrong with the wiring. Even a little bit of corrosion can do that. Start by checking the main computer wiring. Unplug the harness, and if you see some of it's green and corroded, that's what's doing it, and then clean it off with spray electrical cleaner. When it gets really cold outside, a weak connection or a corroded connection will do exactly that. Unfortunately, and since it's an '02 Mustang, I'm going to take a guess here, and I'll bet you that's the problem. It's probably the computer itself, because the computer itself has all kinds of electronic driver circuits, and they only work on a tiny 5-volt reference signal, not much power. The computer's probably going out when it gets really cold, the circuits don't work right, but when it gets above 32, the circuits start working right again. It's probably the computer itself. I mean, it could be a wiring. You got to check all the wiring too. From my experience with Fords, that would mean the computer's gone kaput, and just get another computer, have it reprogrammed, put on. At least it's an older one. It's an '02. The computers aren't that expensive on those to have one put in and have a mechanic program it. Or if you want to do it yourself, places like Napa auto parts stores, you can order the computer for that car and they program it. And you buy it already programmed, so you can just plug it in and drive it. You don't have to pay a mechanic. For 292 says, my 2003 Chevy Silverado has an oil pressure high on, up to 80, and my scan tool shows no codes. The first thing I would do if I were you, just change the oil pressure sending unit. The thing's what? 19 years old. The oil pressure sending unit goes bad. It will give false information. Normally, you're not going to get that high oil pressure. Let's say you change it, and it still shows it's going that high. You got an oil pressure problem. Now you might think, well, my oil pressure's high. Isn't that better? Well, the problem is, the oil pump always pumps the same. If you get high pressure, it's because there's a restriction somewhere after the oil pressure gauge area. So that means that part, the pressure's too high because there's a restriction. Well, after the restriction, the pressure is too low, which is damaging to your engine. It isn't like your pump. The pumps always pump the same. They just spin off the engine. So they're always spinning the same. The only reason the pressure can get high is because somewhere there's a restriction and it builds up behind it. You want to find out. You could have clogged up. You might want to use some engine oil flush. Flush the engine, and if there's dirt in it and it cleans the clog out, then the pressure will go back down to normal. Because if you have high oil pressure somewhere else it's low, because there's got to be a restriction that's making it go higher, because it's always the same pressure the pump's putting out. And if your pressure inside gets higher, it's because somewhere it's restricted. You got to find where the restrictions and fix it. A lot of times it's just the oil pressure sending unit. Your engine's running okay, you don't hear knocking, clanging noises. It's generally the oil pressure sending unit. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.